So I recently released a video where I discussed The Deserter, and why I believe it to be perhaps the single most underrated episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. But I was doing some pondering recently, and you know what? I reckon there's another episode which might just give The Deserter a run for that crown. And funnily enough, it's only 2 letters apart. The Desert is the 11th episode of Avatar's 2nd season, meaning it basically lands right in the middle of Book 2 Earth. Now, the first important thing to note here is the structural differences between Avatar's 3 seasons, because Book 1 Water, which I've already spoken about at length on this channel, functions far more as an episodic season of television, and is not too interested in telling a ton of serialized, interconnected stories. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like there's no multi-episode plots in Avatar's first season. Yes, obviously we have the overarching story of defeating the Fire Lord, which seeps into basically every episode, but Book 1 Water does also have a couple of its own mini arcs, let's call them, such as the Winter Solstice 2-parter, and of course the brilliant final 3-episode story arc set entirely in the Northern Water Tribe. And here's the thing, this more Adventure of the Week style format works perfectly for the introductory, slightly lower stakes vibe of that first season. But as you know if you've seen the show, by the time Book 2 Earth rolls around, there's clearly a far greater level of confidence in basically every department of Avatar's storytelling team, leading to, yes, some of the best character writing and world building in television history, but also a much stronger embrace of long-form, serialized storytelling, you know, arcs which span multiple episodes. In fact, you could easily make the argument that the entire second half of Book 2, from the library onwards, is essentially one long, semi-serialized arc, telling the story of Team Avatar losing Appa, traveling to Ba Sing Se, living in the Earth Kingdom capital while they look for Appa, and finally having to deal with both the Earth Kingdom government and the looming threat of Azula and the Fire Nation. Yes, on paper these are still individual episodes with distinct goals and self-contained beats, but the further you get into Book 2, the more it all begins to feel like a single continuous story. There's a kind of narrative layering that kicks in, with events overlapping way more, consequences carrying across episodes, and everything bound together with more weight and intent. It's clearly the work of a team growing in ambition, leaning harder into serialization without letting go of the show's episodic soul. And like I've already mentioned, the library is the episode which kicks this all off. The moment the gears begin to turn, where you can really feel the narrative structure beginning to focus and tighten. The library is a rock-solid episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender, with some truly iconic moments. Although in my opinion, and this is especially something I've realized since getting into writing more myself, it does feel a little reverse engineered. Clearly the writers knew that Team Avatar somehow needed to learn about the solar eclipse and lose Appa, 2 plot points with massive ripple effects, and built the episode backwards from there, and I do think this slightly mechanical setup, if you want to call it that, can hamper the episode at times. However, any small nitpicks I may have with the writing of the library are made irrelevant when considering how perfectly it sets up the following episode, The Desert, which takes complete advantage of this storytelling shift and ends up being, in my opinion, one of the best episodes of the entire show. The Desert opens with the ramifications of the library's ending. Team Avatar finally have a plan to defeat the Fire Lord, but they've lost Appa in the process. Now, up until this point, Appa has been a constant presence in Avatar. So much so that you kind of take for granted just how important he is, both to this little group of child prodigies, and the overall narrative/emotional structure of the show. In fact, if you watch my long-form analysis of Book 1, I barely even mention the Sky Bison. And that's not because I don't love Appa, it's just because he's kind of like the show's invisible backbone, constantly bailing Team Avatar out of trouble, getting them wherever they need to go, and never complaining about any of it. He's a friend, a battering ram, a source of comic relief, a spiritual animal guide, one of the last connections Aang has to his air nomad heritage, and a 10-ton magical aeroplane. And it's only once he's stolen, and you see these kids wandering this vast ocean of sand, that you realize how truly valuable and integral he has been to everything that's led up to this point. And Aang points this out right away. The episode wastes no time pulling us straight back into the stress and consequences of the library's ending, and this is surely the lowest we've seen Team Avatar up until this point. They're lost, exhausted, arguing, and this is one of those rare moments in Avatar The Last Airbender where it really hits home just how young these kids are. Because realistically, these are all intelligent child prodigies who can do martial arts and take on entire fascist governments basically by themselves. But here, they're stripped of all that. Aang, usually the lovable, playful, powerful monk, hits perhaps his most vulnerable point in the whole show here, after losing his best friend and spiritual guide. And honestly, it's a difficult watch. It's similar to how angry Sokka gets at him in The Deserter. It is not nice to see our favourite characters fall into despair and grief and rage, but it's also a completely realistic reaction and makes them feel more three-dimensional. Aang even snaps at Toph, despite the fact that she just saved all their lives, claiming that she never cared about Appa and wanted him gone. Again, it's difficult to watch, but it feels completely authentic and honest to these characters and this situation they've found themselves in. So Aang is obviously heartbroken and angry, and eventually flies away to look for Appa. Meanwhile, Toph, usually the headstrong, overpowered badass who can get them out of any situation with some earthbending, is basically rendered into a rather helpless 12-year-old here, thanks to both her guilt of losing Appa, and the sand which seriously hinders her whole feet vision thing. And Sokka, usually the pragmatic leader and planner, drinks cactus juice along with Momo, which turns out to be something along the lines of peyote. And despite the fact that 1, this is overall a very serious and vulnerable episode, and 2, I've probably watched or heard this scene 1,000 times by now, it's still hilarious. Which I guess is just a testament to how good the show is at balancing comedy and emotional weight without undercutting either. Anyway, my point is that the writers did the smart thing of seriously nerfing all of our characters by stripping them of their defining strength. Aang, the group's emotional core, the moral compass who usually keeps everyone grounded, is clouded by grief and anger. Sokka, the master of strategy, the guy who's always thinking 3 steps ahead, is tripping on cactus juice. And Toph, the one who makes you feel like nothing can really go wrong as long as she's around, is completely physically compromised by the sand. And for the first time since we met her 5 episodes ago, she actually feels really vulnerable. And so, in one of the best character moments of the entire show, it is up to Katara of the Southern Water Tribe to rally everyone together and figure out how they're gonna survive this mess. And it's honestly just such an inspirational presentation of stoicism and resilience from her, especially considering she's also out of her element here, being a waterbender stuck in a desert. I especially remember that moment when Aang finally returns, having been unable to find Appa, and Katara just looks at how hopeless everyone is, and the shading is really dramatic, and she's just like, no, I refuse to die here. We are making it out of this desert, and I don't care how the rest of you feel. It's such a powerful example of human endurance and Katara's unwavering sense of hope, which honestly just gives me goosebumps every single time I watch it. Like, this is some serious Ernest Shackleton circa the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition of 1914 to 1917 energy. You know what I'm talking about. The ship's frozen in ice, we've eaten the sled dogs, the men are hallucinating seals, but no one is dying today. It really is just peak Avatar The Last Airbender. Anyway, while all this emotion and human resilience is happening, we also have the B-plot involving Zuko and Iroh attempting to find safe passage to Ba Sing Se. And I can definitely see the argument that this story kinda weighs down the episode compared to the perfection of the A-plot, especially considering it involves the infamous duo of Toph's earthbending teacher and the wrestling announcer guy, who are surely 2 of the most bland and underwritten side characters of the whole show. However, I would argue that first of all, you really do need a B-plot here, something to break up all the intensity and emotional exhaustion of the desert arc. But second of all, I don't know man, I think this B-plot is actually pretty cool, mostly because it serves as our introduction to the Order of the White Lotus, who will have a pretty big impact on the story moving forward. We get that amazing scene where Iroh sits down with another wise-looking old guy, they exchange some enigmatic philosophy in classic Avatar fashion before playing a game of Pai Sho. It's all rather tropey, if you will, but personally I love it when Avatar really leans into its influences, and this scene is just a great example of that. It adds a ton of depth and mystery and texture to the world, reinforcing the idea that any stranger at any random bar in this universe could potentially be far more important and dangerous than they initially let on. I mean, who knows what other secret societies and orders exist in this world? It's just cool, really. I don't know, it's just a nice way to flesh out the world. And I love the Iroh line where he claims Zuko has little appreciation for the cryptic arts. Again, it's not a line you'll find on a t-shirt or anything, but I love it. I love when this show hints at the greater mysteries and spiritual depth of the universe. Anyway, Iroh and Zuko are of course eventually able to escape from the two men, and begin their journey to the Earth Kingdom capital where they may perhaps be safe from the Fire Nation. Again, I must preface, this isn't the strongest B-plot in the show, and maybe if it was as good as the A-plot, I'd be calling the desert the single best episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. But I do think it serves the story well. It balances out the episode, gives us some room to breathe, and most importantly, it doesn't overstay its welcome. It knows the desert stuff is the main powerhouse here, and it doesn't try to compete. It just quietly adds to the mythology and world building, keeps Zuko and Iroh's journey moving, and then gets out of the way. Back in the desert, everyone is still miserable. Sokka and Momo are still hallucinating off whatever was in that cactus juice, but Team Avatar have now at least stumbled upon one of the gliders that the Sandbenders use, and are eventually able to make their way to this huge rock, which I guess is like the magnetic center of the desert. I don't know enough about magnets, but I think that's what it is. And I love how Sokka just immediately goes to consume the mysterious wasp liquid without any hesitation.
You've been hallucinating on cactus juice all day, and then you just lick something you find stuck to the wall of a cave?
I have a natural curiosity.
Anyway, we then get this brief fight scene with these wasps, where Toph is somewhat able to be useful again. But of course the most memorable moment by far is when one of the wasps takes Momo, and Aang, simply refusing to lose any more of his spiritual air nomad animal guides, goes after the wasp. At first you think the emotional beat is going to be him saving Momo, but he actually does that fairly easily. The real impact comes after, when Aang continues to chase after the wasp, who is now just trying to get away from him, and seemingly kills the animal despite it serving no more threat to anyone. Now, Avatar fans often like to make fun of this moment, considering how later on in, I believe, Sozin's Comet, Aang claims to have never taken another life. But personally, I think this moment hits really hard, and it makes complete sense that Aang would choose to forget this ever happened. It's the kind of moment you can only really get when your Joseph Campbell-esque protagonist is also a monk, a grief-stricken kid, usually so into the positive vibrations of peace and love, taking out his anger on a living thing that wasn't even a threat anymore. It's really quite powerful, and look, overall this episode is not the easiest watch, especially if you're a big Aang fan like me, but while Appa's loss is of course a tragedy, it does allow this second half of Book 2 to really dig into Aang's inner workings and vulnerabilities and complexities, and that is of course a good thing. Anyway, we then get to the end of the episode. Eventually the wasps are scared away by the Sandbenders who arrive at this magnetic rock thing. Unfortunately for them, however, Aang is not a frightened wasp, but an angry, powerful, magic, messianic being. He questions the Sandbenders about Appa, and through Toph's ability as a feat-based lie detector, they eventually find out that one of the Sandbenders is the one who stole and sold Appa. And can we please talk about this guy for a second? Like, truly one of the most despicable human beings in the entire show. Right up there with Ozai and that old guy who snitched on Haru. Bro literally came across a 12-year-old blind girl holding up a sinking building in the middle of the desert, and his first thought was to steal what must have looked like her pet and only mode of transportation and leave her there to die. It's actually crazy, and Aang, quite justifiably may I add, ends up entering the Avatar state, and this is where we get to the moment which sends shivers down my spine every single time I watch it. In fact, I'm already dreading the emotional labor of editing this video later and having to watch this scene time and time again. But anyway, Aang becomes fully enraged here, destroying the glider things and yelling at the Sandbenders with this deep voice, which seems to suggest that all the past avatars are joining in with him like some, I don't know, ancient ancestral chorus of doom. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the only other time I remember Aang doing this is in Sozin's Comet. I could be wrong there, but regardless, it's a rather staggering image. It seriously feels like this 12-year-old spiritual savior is about to lose control and massacre a bunch of sandbenders. Sokka grabs Toph, yelling at her to get out of the blast zone, but Katara remains motionless. We get this chilling shot of her solemnly standing her ground as the dust flies chaotically around her, and then she simply grabs Aang's hand. Now, we've had moments like this before, for example in the Southern Air Temple, but this scene has the added weight of everything these two characters have been through for the last season and a half. Only Katara could possibly be able to calm down this sensitive monk who has just lost his best friend, and the biggest reminder of his culture and heritage, which has been massacred. Aang turns and gives her this terrifying look, but she remains calm and eventually brings the Avatar back down to Earth. Jeremy Zuckerman's music is angelic, and the episode ends with Katara and Aang crying in each other's arms. And honestly, it is one of the most powerful things I've ever come across in fiction, I think. Like, this scene gives me chills in a way very few things have been able to. It is such a perfect ending to such a mature and emotionally resonant episode, and really sets the tone moving forward. Because from here on out, Avatar doesn't really let up, both in terms of the quality of the writing and in terms of how said writers begin to seriously challenge these characters we love so much. As that's of course where growth comes from. But that's gonna be it for now. The desert is honestly one of my favourite episodes of this whole show. I do understand it's not as flashy as a Blind Bandit or a Boiling Rock two-parter, but I do think it's some of the most emotionally mature stuff the Avatar writers ever pulled off. And honestly, I don't want to be that guy, but how people can watch this and not think Aang and Katara are right for each other, I just don't understand. Like, this episode, and especially its ending, is such a beautiful presentation of adolescent love and the endurance of the human spirit, or whatever. But anyway, please let me know what you thought of the desert in the comment section. And before we head out, just to let you know that I am indeed still working on that Book 2 Earth analysis / review / ranking. I would love to get it out in August, but we'll have to wait and see. And lastly, this is a bit random, but I have gotten into animation a bit myself recently, so if you are in any way interested in seeing what I've been making, I have left a link to it in the description. It's basically just a quirky YouTube cartoon telling a quirky story in a quirky world, and is mainly just a vehicle through which I can experiment with stuff and, you know, let off some creative steam. So check that out if you would like, and once again, thank you for watching this video. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.